In the winter of 1921, deep in the Sawtooth backcountry, a lone cabin glowed where every other cabin on the ridge sat, half frozen in the dark. Inside, a trapper named Sam McKenzie warmed his hands not over a polished cast-iron stove, but over something that looked like a blacksmith's mistake: 3 battered steel buckets welded together at crooked angles, pipe jutting from the side like a broken limb. The men downriver called it junk. Some called it dangerous. Most just called it insane. They had spent good money on real stoves, heavy iron beasts shipped in by freight wagon, the kind you bragged about over whiskey. Sam, meanwhile, had walked out of the general store with 3 cheap 5-gallon buckets and a quiet conviction that knowledge was worth more than hardware. He punched holes where no sane stove maker would, packed rocks and sand where fire had no business touching, and claimed that this bundle of scrap would burn 1 load of wood for 9 straight hours while he slept. To mountain men who had spent their lives waking every 2 or 3 hours to feed the fire before the cold crept in, Sam's claims sounded like pure fantasy. You did not sleep through a winter night in Idaho unless you wanted to wake up to frost on your blanket and ice in your beard. When word spread that McKenzie planned to heat his new homestead with a bucket stove, the jokes wrote themselves. Buckets don't heat cabins, they said. Buckets carry water. Stoves cost $60, and sanity costs more than $1.50. But as the first hard cold closed in, something strange happened. The smoke from Sam's crooked stovepipe rose thin and steady, while everyone else's chimneys roared and died in frantic cycles of blazing hot and bitter cold. Night after night, his cabin stayed warm on a fraction of the wood. The contraption the valley had laughed at was quietly rewriting the rules of winter. And the real story is not just that it worked, but why it worked, and what that forgotten insight can still do for you if you care more about understanding than about what something looks like. Sam had not always been the kind of man who welded buckets together and bet his winter on a theory. The year before, he had lived in town, sleeping in a rented bunkhouse room after long days at the sawmill, watching other men stumble back from the saloon and complain about the cost of coal and cordwood. When he was not hauling boards, he was standing by whatever stove he could get near, feeling how the heat poured off in waves, watching how fast the wood vanished, seeing the same pattern in house after house: bright flames, hot cheeks, cold backs, and chimneys blasting money into the sky as orange sparks. Most men noticed the comfort, but not the waste. Sam noticed the numbers. He counted how many armloads it took to get from cold as a barn to shirt sleeves in January. He watched how often women and children opened the firebox door, how fast the fuel dropped away, how quickly the iron cooled once the flames died. At night, while others snored, he sat under weak lamplight with a tattered pamphlet on combustion, tracing diagrams of airflow and scribbling rough calculations in the margins. It was not elegant math. It did not need to be. What mattered to Sam was the pattern: too much air, too little time for heat to soak into anything, too many calories rushing up the flue. Curiosity became obsession. He bothered the town blacksmith with questions no paying customer asked. Why did the forge burn so hot with such a small fuel bed? How did closing one vent and opening another change the color of the fire? Why did piling metal around the coals make the heat linger? The smith, amused, showed him how air could be guided, choked, or split to change the character of the burn. Around the same time, a traveling missionary passing through with tales from China described simple cook stoves that used twigs rather than logs, burning clean and fierce on almost nothing. And in the bunkhouse, an old prospector talked about gas from wood that would light off a second time if you gave it the right path. Sam did what almost no one else in that valley bothered to do. He stitched those scraps of information together. Where others saw a forge, a cook stove, a campfire, and a drafty iron heater. As separate things, he saw one puzzle scattered across a dozen examples. If wood was really releasing gases, and those gases were where most of the energy lived, then the problem was not that winter was cruel or that iron was weak. The problem was design. Stoves were built to look and feel solid, not to trap every usable bit of heat. By the time the thaw came and the sawmill let him go, Sam had arrived at a simple conclusion. When he finally built his own homestead in the high country, he would not buy a stove. He would build a fire system that obeyed physics first and fashion never. When Sam finally laid his tools out on the packed dirt floor of his new cabin, he was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to build a system that the mountains couldn't bully, a heater that squeezed every shred of warmth out of every inch of wood. The 3 steel buckets he bought for $1.50 were not symbols of poverty or eccentricity. They were components chosen for one reason. Thin metal reacts fast to heat. Unlike cast iron, which needs a roaring blaze before it even wakes up, steel leaps from cold to warm almost instantly. Sam wanted something that absorbed heat fast, redirected it efficiently, and never let the fire burn farther or faster than it needed to. He started with the bottom bucket, the foundation. Into its base, he punched 10 small holes carefully spaced. Not big enough to gulp air like a traditional stove, but just enough to drip-feed oxygen into the burn. Inside, he stood fist-sized river stones around a hollow tin cylinder, creating a narrow combustion chamber flanked by thermal mass. Those stones, inert and unimpressive to anyone else, were the heart of his design. Once heated, they would hold warmth long after the flames died, releasing it slowly, like a sleeping animal breathing out against the cold. The second bucket was pure airflow engineering. Sam cut the top and bottom away until all that remained was a metal collar, a swirling chamber where gases rising from the burn would be forced to linger. In a regular stove, heat races upward in a panic, desperate to escape through a wide chimney. Sam's contraption refused to hurry. He welded a stub of stovepipe to the side, not the top. That single sideways detour was enough to make hot gases bleed their heat into the bucket walls before exiting. Every second they stayed trapped, another fraction of wasted energy became usable warmth. Then came the part that baffled his neighbors the most, the sand bucket. 50 pounds of dry river sand poured into a rusty steel shell. It looked absurd, pointless, almost theatrical. But Sam knew better. Sand is slow. Sand is patient. Heat seeps into it grain by grain, storing energy in a way metal never could. When flames faded at 3 or 4 in the morning, that sand would quietly repay the cabin with hours of gentle, radiant heat. While other men shivered awake to reload their stoves, Sam intended to keep sleeping. From a distance, the whole assembly looked like a stack of junk. Up close, it was deliberate engineering. 3 buckets, 3 rolls, 1 to control the burn, 1 to harvest escaping energy, 1 to store it for the long hours after. To Sam, this wasn't scrap metal. It was a machine built on principles no one else in the valley had bothered to test. And when winter tightened its fist, those principles would matter more than appearances. Sam chose November 8th for the first real test, not because the date meant anything, but because the cold had finally settled with that sharp edge the mountains use to separate confidence from reality. He gathered a bundle of dry pine sticks, nothing thicker than a thumb, and packed them vertically inside the narrow tin cylinder. To anyone else, it looked wrong. Fires were supposed to be built wide, piled in layers coaxed from the bottom. But Sam wasn't building a campfire. He was building a controlled descent of heat, a candle made of wood that would slowly collapse into its own ember bed. He struck the match at the top. The flame bloomed slowly, almost lazily, like it wasn't sure whether this odd arrangement deserved to burn. Sam watched the first wisps of smoke curl upward, then watched them hesitate as they reached the swirling chamber of the second bucket. Instead of racing out the pipe in a hot, wasteful rush, the gases spun, slowed, and heated the walls. The bucket began to warm immediately, not in the violent, radiant way cast iron stoves blast heat, but in a steady rising glow. After half an hour, the stones in the lowest bucket were radiating a gentle warmth. The sand above was no longer cold to the touch, and the wood it had barely shrunk. The top was charred, the burn zone creeping downward at a pace closer to hand movement than fire. Outside, the air hovered around freezing. Inside, Sam watched the mercury climb, 50 degrees, 55 to 60 degrees, then 65 degrees within an hour. No extra fuel, no tending, no roar of flames. Just a quiet hum of controlled combustion. 3 hours in the cabin held steady at 70 degrees. Most stoves would have peaked and faded by now, leaving the owners scrambling to reload. But Sam's burn column had only descended a few inches. The fire was eating through the sticks like a slow, patient animal, 1 inch per hour. The stones glowed with stored heat. The sand radiated a soft warmth that felt almost like body heat. And the stovepipe breathed out air so cool you could touch it without fear. By the 6th hour, the temperature dipped only 2 degrees. Not because the fire failed, but because the system didn't allow extremes. No sudden spikes, no plunges. Just rhythm. Steady, predictable, almost mechanical. Sam watched the last stretch of glowing wood burn into coals somewhere around the 9th hour. When the final ember died, the cabin remained at 65 degrees, held aloft by the thermal mass he had designed to outlive the fire. It was the first night in his years in the mountains that Sam didn't have to choose between warmth and sleep. The bucket stove had done what no cast iron giant ever could. It had turned a handful of sticks into an entire night of comfort. And Sam, sitting in the amber quiet of his cabin, understood exactly what was going to happen next. Tomorrow the mockery would stop. The curiosity would begin. At dawn the next morning, long before the sun broke over the ridgeline, Sam heard boots crunching through the frost outside his cabin. Only one man in the valley walked with that impatient, irritated rhythm, William Bradford. He arrived with a half-amused scowl, arms folded tight against the cold. William had spent the night feeding his iron stove every 2 hours, fighting waves of heat and chill. He wasn't there to congratulate Sam. He was there to catch him lying. "How'd your bucket circus perform?" he asked, voice thick from lack of sleep. Sam opened the door wider. The warmth that spilled out made William blink. Inside, the air felt lived in, not overheated, just evenly warm, the kind of warmth that usually takes a roaring stove and a new log every hour. Sam didn't say a word. He only pointed to the bucket stove, its metal still radiating a gentle glow, even though the fire had gone out hours earlier. William leaned close to the tin cylinder, expecting leftover flames or hidden coals. Instead, he saw only warm sand and fading heat stored from the night before. "You didn't reload," he pressed. "Not once," Sam said. "Went to sleep at 10. Woke up at 7. The disbelief on William's face was almost painful to watch. For a man who had built his entire mountain routine around tending a fire every few hours, the idea of an untouched stove surviving the night felt like a betrayal of nature itself. Still unconvinced, William challenged Sam to repeat the demonstration. They agreed to run the test again that evening. When 5 o'clock came, William returned this time, armed with a pocket thermometer, a notebook, and the grim determination of someone preparing to witness either genius or madness. Sam packed the stove exactly as before, thumb-thick sticks dry as bones stacked vertically. He lit the top, closed the cabin door, and let the system breathe. 1 hour in, William checked his thermometer. 68 degrees. He wrote it down with a sharp, irritated stroke. 2 hours in 70 degrees. No reload. No flicker of panic from the stove. The burn zone crept downward with surgical precision, exactly as Sam described, 1 inch per hour. William crouched beside the stove, running a hand over each bucket. Warm, hot, very hot. Then warm again. A layered gradient of controlled temperature, not the chaotic blast of his own iron stove. By 3 hours, William's skepticism was cracking. "Where's the rest of the wood going?" he asked, almost pleading. Sam gestured at the chamber. "It hasn't burned yet. It's drying, gasifying, waiting its turn." The idea disturbed William more than the heat itself. The fire was not roaring or starving. It was thinking. It was pacing itself. It was behaving like something designed rather than something tamed. William stayed until 8 that night. The cabin stayed warm. The burn stayed steady. And sometime between the 3rd and 4th hour, his resistance finally collapsed. He didn't say Sam was right. He didn't admit he was wrong. He simply stared at the bucket stove and whispered, "I need one." And in that moment, when pride bowed to proof, Sam knew the valley was about to change. Word travels strangely in the mountains. A broken snowshoe could take a week to reach the next valley. But the rumor of a miracle fire that burned all night spread faster than smoke in a canyon wind. Within days, trappers who had once snorted at Sam's welded buckets now found excuses to pass through his part of the river. Some brought whiskey, some brought questions. Most brought the same mixture of curiosity and embarrassment, the quiet shame of men who mocked something they didn't understand. Sam never gloated. He simply opened his door, let them warm their hands, explained the stove the same way he'd learned it, one principle at a time. He walked them through the rocks that held heat long after the burn ended. He tapped the sand bucket that stored the warmth like a battery. He pointed to the tiny air holes at the bottom and showed how restricting oxygen didn't weaken the fire, it refined it. Slow burn, complete burn, zero waste. By late November, word had hardened into belief. Men who once bragged about their iron stoves now compared notes about airflow, wood thickness, and gasification like students around a camp table. They argued about hole spacing the way old-timers argued about rifling twist. And the most stubborn of all, William became Sam's most vocal convert. It wasn't prestige they cared about. It was survival. Every man in those hills had spent too many nights stumbling from bed with frozen fingers to feed a dying fire. They knew the cold was a predator patient and merciless. Anything that gave them a full night's sleep without fear of waking up to an icy cabin was not a convenience, it was salvation. By December's first blizzard, 7 bucket stoves were burning across the valley. The results were nearly identical. Burn time, 8 to 10 hours. Wood savings, 60 to 75%. Cabin temperature stable, not swinging wildly. Sleep uninterrupted for the first time in years. The transformation was so dramatic that men who once measured their winters in cords of wood and nights of exhaustion suddenly found themselves with extra time they didn't know how to spend. Some slept. Some trapped more. Some simply sat with the strange, unfamiliar luxury of not having to fight the cold every 2 hours. And as each new stove sprang to life, Sam watched something remarkable happen. The idea no longer belonged to him. It began passing from cabin to cabin like a shared secret of the mountains, simple, practical, powerful. A design with no brand name, no manufacturer, no price tag. Just knowledge, pure and portable. By the time winter deepened, the joke that started as Sam's insane bucket stove had become something else entirely, a quiet revolution. Forged not from metal, but from understanding. If you stripped away the folklore and the frontier scenery, Sam's stove wasn't magic at all. It was physics, plain, stubborn physics that every manufactured stove of the era ignored. Most people think fire is simple wood, burns, flames, rise, heat comes out. But Sam knew the truth buried inside every stick of timber. Wood doesn't burn, gas does. And the only way to harvest all the energy inside that gas is to force it to meet three things at once: heat, oxygen, and time. The bucket stove was nothing more than a system engineered to guarantee all three. Start with the top-down burn. Every traditional stove lights from the bottom, which sounds logical until you realize it's the worst way to extract energy. Lighting from the bottom means the rising gases escape freely, slipping past the flames before they ever ignite. Sam flipped the script. By lighting the top, he forced the gases to travel downward into the hottest part of the fire. They couldn't escape without being cooked, cracked, and burned. That alone made his system 30 to 40% more efficient than anything the valley had ever seen. Then there was the air control. Sam didn't let the fire gulp oxygen like a starving animal. He rationed every breath through 10 tiny holes, less than a square inch of intake compared to the 10 square inches on a typical iron stove. That restriction slowed the burn to a crawl, turning each stick of wood into a long-distance runner instead of a sprinter. Slow burn meant complete burn. Complete burn meant no wasted fuel. The swirling chamber inside the second bucket played a role, too. Instead of letting heat rush up the chimney, Sam forced it to linger and make contact with the metal. Every swirl shaved another degree off the exhaust temperature. When William measured his own stovepipe at nearly 600 degrees, he was shocked to learn Sam's pipe barely reached 200 millifarad. That difference, those missing 300 millifarad, were not lost. They were inside the cabin instead of floating into the sky. And then the most misunderstood piece: thermal mass. Rocks and sand don't look like technology, but they behave like it. They absorb heat steadily, hold it quietly, and release it long after the fire dies. Most stoves are brief, noisy creatures, hot, then cold, then hot, then cold again. Sam's design smoothed those spikes into a gentle curve. His cabin didn't swing 30 degrees between reloads like William's. It drifted slowly, predictably, comfortably. Modern engineers would someday build devices called rocket stoves, sleek insulated systems that burn small fuel extremely efficiently. They would write papers, hold workshops, and claim innovation. But Sam McKenzie built the same principles into 3 buckets in 1921. Armed with nothing but observation, curiosity, and the willingness to look foolish long enough to be right. Because that's what the bucket stove really proved. You don't need exotic materials or patented technology to bend the laws of heat to your will. You just need to understand them well enough to design around them. And Sam understood them better than any catalog stove maker of his time. By the time December tightened its grip on the valley, every man who had built a bucket stove began noticing a pattern that had nothing to do with airflow or combustion chemistry. It had to do with something far more human: the return of rest. Mountain winters had always been a barter system: warmth in exchange for sleep. You fed the fire, or the cold punished you. That rhythm shaped the lives, tempers, and exhaustion of every trapper from Idaho to Montana. But Sam's design broke that trade. While William was stumbling out of bed at midnight, then 2, then 4 eyes, burning fingers numb, Sam was curled under his blankets, breathing slow the thermal mass of his stove, radiating a steady warmth through the cabin. He wasn't toughing it out. He wasn't lucky. He simply wasn't being robbed of rest the way every other man was. The more the valley used the bucket stove, the more obvious the difference became. Men who had always dragged themselves through the short daylight hours suddenly had energy. They set more traps, repaired, more gear, traveled farther upriver without feeling hollowed out. A full night of unbroken sleep in the mountains was not comfort, it was power. and Sam had found a way to give it back. Then came the numbers. Mountain men might scoff at theory, but they kept meticulous track of firewood. William, with his proud cast-iron stove, burned through 4 cords a month, a mountain of chopped timber. Sam used one cord, not because he was frugal, because physics had made waste unnecessary. 4 cords meant 4 times the felling, hauling, splitting, stacking, drying. 4 times the hours of labor. 4 times the energy poured into an endless chore. When men realized the stove gave them back not just wood but time, things shifted fast. Some laughed at themselves for ever doubting. Some grew quiet, thinking about all the winters they had lost to needless labor. And some felt something close to envy for every hour Sam had slept while they battled the cold. Even the economic comparison was startling. William's iron stove cost $60, a small fortune for a trapper. Sam's cost 1/50th of that. Over 8 years, Sam spent $2 replacing a single worn bucket. William spent another $60 replacing his cracked cast-iron stove. The math was brutal, undeniable, and almost insulting. 60 times cheaper, 4 times less wood, 0 lost sleep. And yet, the real revelation wasn't the money or the fuel. It was what happened when comfort stopped being a constant fight. When the cabin didn't swing wildly between scorching and freezing. When nights didn't feel like battles and mornings didn't arrive with the weight of exhaustion. Sam had designed a stove, yes, but what he had really built was a system that gave men the one resource more valuable than heat wood, or dollars a winter that no longer drained their life away. By the time the winter of 1921 turned to spring, Sam's bucket stove had quietly become part of the region's unwritten lore. A kind of backcountry secret passed between men who rarely trusted anything new. By the next year, a dozen more trappers had built their own versions. Some adjusted the hole size. Some swapped sand for gravel. Some added a second swirling chamber or experimented with different metals. But no matter the variation, the core remained the same top-down combustion-restricted airflow, captured gases, and thermal mass. The design spread not because anyone advertised it, but because the results were impossible to dispute. When a man walked into a neighbor's cabin and felt warmth that stayed warm, or when he stepped outside and noticed the quiet whisper of heat escaping instead of a roaring plume of waste, he wanted that for himself. No salesman required, no marketing, no brand, just proof. And yet, even as the idea spread through Idaho and slipped into Montana's trapline camps, it never became a product. No company forged McKenzie stoves. No catalog listed them. There was no patent, no blueprint, no entrepreneur with a wagon full of supplies looking to cash in. You couldn't buy one. You could only learn one. And because learning takes curiosity, and curiosity is harder to pass down than tools, the stove's future was already fragile. Sam used bucket stoves for nearly 3 decades. Through blizzards, drought winters, and late-season freezes, he refined the design, but never abandoned the core principles. When he left the mountains at 73 to live with his nephew in Boise, he left behind no monument, no workshop, no written instructions, just cabins warmed by knowledge that many assumed they would always remember. But memory in the mountains fades faster than tracks in fresh snow. By the 1950s, propane heaters and mass-manufactured stoves became status symbols. Younger trappers trusted what came in a crate, not what came from scrap. The old men who knew the bucket system died or moved to town, and the new generation saw 3 rusty buckets as junk again, just as the first generation once had. By the 1970s, the bucket stove had nearly vanished. A few aging trappers told the story to skeptical listeners. One mentioned it in a letter to his brother. Another recalled a contraption that burned all night. But without drawings or commercial backing, The design sank into folklore dismissed as exaggeration or half-remembered pioneer myth. Then something ironic happened. In the 1990s, engineers, researchers, and off-grid communities began championing rocket stoves, hyper-efficient burners that used tiny amounts of fuel and insulated chambers to maximize heat. Workshops filled. Academic papers praised the innovation. People marveled at how modern science had revolutionized simple combustion. But anyone who had stood in Sam's cabin in 1921 would have recognized the truth. Instantly, the innovation was old. The physics was unchanged. The principles were identical. And somewhere in the quiet ridges of Idaho, long before the world cared about efficiency or sustainability, a trapper with $1.50's worth of buckets had already solved the problem. What died was not the idea, only the memory of the man who understood it. If the story ended with a clever stove and a warm cabin, it would be charming but easy to forget. What makes Sam's invention endure, even after the world misplaced his name, is what it teaches about how real solutions are born. His bucket stove wasn't a curiosity. It was a blueprint for thinking, one that challenges the way we approach comfort technology and even survival itself. The first lesson is brutal in its simplicity. Rate of combustion beats size of combustion. William's massive iron stove could ton logs the size of his forearm, but it devoured them like a starving animal, fast, loud, and wasteful. Sam's thin sticks burned slowly and completely, leaving almost nothing unspent. The mountain men assumed bigger was better. The physics proved smaller, but smarter was unbeatable. In our lives, we make the same mistake, buying bigger tools, larger systems, stronger devices, when the real fix is usually control, not scale. The second lesson cuts even deeper. Materials don't create efficiency, design does. Cast iron looks strong, respectable, expensive. Buckets look cheap. And yet, the buckets won. They won because Sam built a system instead of buying a product. He identified what mattered: heat retention, burn direction, airflow, gas recapture, and redesigned the entire experience around those principles. Today we're surrounded by devices built to sell, not to work. Sam reminds us that understanding the why will always outperform the wow. The third lesson is subtle but transformative. Thermal mass changes everything. Not just in stoves, but in homes, habits, and systems. Most modern heating is frantic: blast heat, cool down, repeat. The bucket stove taught the opposite: store warmth, release it slowly, and let stability replace chaos. Life feels like that too. Most people sprint, collapse, and sprint again. But the systems that sustain us are the ones that spread effort over time, holding energy instead of dumping it. The fourth lesson is the most human: sleep is not a luxury, it's a survival advantage. William's iron stove didn't just burn wood. It burned hours of his life. It stole rest, clarity, strength, and patience. Sam gained all of that back with one careful design choice. In a world where exhaustion is worn like a badge of honor, the bucket stove stands as a quiet rebuke. A reminder that systems should support life, not drain it. And the fifth lesson is the one people resist the most. Innovation rarely looks respectable in the beginning. 3 rusty buckets. Holes punched at random, sand in a stove. It sounded ridiculous. It looked ridiculous. But results don't bow to appearances. The men who mocked Sam eventually built stoves just like his. Not because they changed their minds, because the truth refused to let them stay wrong. Knowledge spreads on its own schedule. First through laughter, then through resistance, then through imitation, and finally through forgetting until someone rediscovers what should never have been lost. That cycle played out exactly with Sam's stove, and it's happening again today, with every new version of the rocket stove praised as cutting edge. The final lesson is the one Sam never said aloud. but lived every winter he survived. Understanding is the most valuable tool any human can own. Understanding that wood burns twice, first as solid, then as gas. Understanding that slowing a fire makes it stronger. Understanding that simple materials can outperform expensive ones. Understanding that comfort is a design problem, not a financial one. Sam's stove was not a miracle. It was a reminder. A reminder that the world rewards the learner, not the spender. That mountains bow not to money, but to mastery. That 3 buckets, if arranged with insight, can outperform $60 of manufactured confidence. And maybe the most important reminder of all forgotten wisdom is only forgotten because someone stopped telling the story. Tonight you heard it again. What you choose to do with it, build, adapt, rethink, or simply remember, is how the story continues. Long after Sam McKenzie left the mountains, long after his cabin settled into the soil, and the river smoothed the stones he once carried. The real legacy he left behind wasn't metal or heat or even a clever design. It was a shift in mindset, one that every viewer of this channel can still use today. Because whether you live in a cabin at 7,000 feet or a small apartment in the city, the principle remains the same. Comfort, efficiency, and resilience don't come from buying the biggest, newest thing. They come from understanding how systems work, then shaping them to your advantage. That's why stories like Sam's matter. They're not nostalgia. They're instruction. Hidden inside every historical detail is a blueprint for living smarter with less, not living poorer, but living better, because you refuse to waste energy, time, or effort. Sam didn't fight the cold with brute force the way William did. He turned the cold into a predictable opponent and engineered a system that beat it without stress, noise, or endless labor. That mindset, the ability to step back, rethink a problem, and build a new path forward, is exactly what Wildwood exists to preserve. Most people today feel the same exhaustion mountain men once felt: energy in short supply nights, too short labor, too constant. And just like those trappers, a modern life sells us cast iron solutions, shiny, expensive, inefficient. We're told to consume instead of understand, to replace instead of repair, to assume instead of investigate. Sam refused all of that. With nothing but curiosity and a few steel buckets, he created something that outperformed the established wisdom of his entire community. That's the heart of this channel, reclaiming forgotten thinking, so you can live more independently, comfortably, and wisely, whether you're building a stove, a shelter, a workshop, or a life built on principle instead of pressure. If you followed the story this far, it means you're the kind of person Sam would have appreciated, someone who doesn't just want the what, but the why. Someone who respects the unusual idea long enough to test it. Someone who doesn't mind being doubted on the way to being right. So before we wrap up, I want to tell you the same thing Sam once told the men who doubted him. If you think this shouldn't work, watch carefully. And if it does work, don't forget to pass it on. If you're ready to learn the kinds of skills and forgotten principles that kept people alive, warm and thriving without modern conveniences, then you're in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of knowledge we bring back from the edges of history. Because somewhere out there, in an old book or an abandoned workshop or a half-remembered story, is the next bucket stove, a simple idea, powerful enough to change everything. And here on Wildwood, we intend to make sure it's not forgotten again.